This is a presentation of Northeast Streaming Sports.
If you like the sweet science, get ready to talk boxing on the Gloved Fist podcast with top boxing writers Frank Lotierzo and Jack Hirsch. Frank, a former amateur boxer out of Philadelphia, writes for NY Fights and can be seen on the Boxing Channel. Jack, an amateur boxer who competed in the New York Golden Gloves, was a 6-term president of the Boxing Writers Association. And now, here's Frank Lotierzo and Jack Hirsch.
And we're back. Welcome to Glove Fist. My name is Frank Lotierzo, former fighter, part-time writer, full-time observer, and I'm joined by former 6-term Boxing Writers Association of America president, Jack Hirsch. Tonight, we're going to talk about some fights that happened last week. We're going to look ahead to a big fight next week. We're going to look back at the stellar career of Marvin Johnson, 3-time heavyweight champ. And we're also going to look back at one of the best fights.
You say heavyweight, light heavyweight.
Light heavyweight champ, yes. I'm sorry. And one of the best fights that most of us has probably ever seen, and that's the April 15th, 1985 slugfest between middleweight champ Marvin Hagler and junior middleweight champ Thomas Hearns. Good evening, Jack. How are you?
You threw me off with that last remark because you mentioned Marvin Johnson, and then you said one of the best fights we ever saw, and I thought you were going to say with Matthew Saad Muhammad.
We can do that next week because it's April 22nd.
You're correct about Hagler and Hearns.
One of the all-time greats. Jack, speaking of middleweight fights, there was a big middleweight fight in Japan this past weekend for the unification belt. I believe 3 of the belts are tied up between Ryoto Murata and Gennady Golovkin. We both picked Golovkin. He won by a stoppage in the 9th round. We both saw the fight. Time is yours.
Yeah, unbalanced, Golovkin looked better than I thought he would. I didn't know which Golovkin we were going to get. If we were going to get a very old Golovkin, the skills very diminished, we both thought he could lose this fight, that Murata would have to beat him. But we both knew if we caught Galata at the very top of his game, you know, he's going to stop Murata and he's going to look impressive doing so. Now, it's easy to say we got something in the middle, but I think the needle was pointed slightly more towards the old Golovkin, not old in the sense, in the current sense, but like the old-time Golovkin we knew years ago. Unbalanced after shaky start, he performed very well. He did perform very well. I didn't like what I saw in the early rounds, but the way he grinded Murata down into defeat was impressive. And does this change our opinion, Frank, of how we do against Canelo Alvarez? Before the Murata fight, neither of us wanted to see Golovkin fight Canelo because we didn't want to see a sad ending, Golovkin go out on a bad note, you know, against the guy who he was at the very least even with, you know, with the two of them if they fought in their primes in the third fight. But I think he's competitive with Canelo in the third fight. I don't think it's a charity case. I'd still be going with Canelo to beat him. But, you know, it's not out of the question that Golovkin could upset Canelo, you know, in the third fight. That's what I'm trying to say. And I didn't have that feeling before the Murata fight.
Well, Jack, the fight that we saw the other night with Murata, it didn't change anything in my mind. I've maintained if Golovkin did not beat Canelo the first time, he'd never hold that win on his record because I believed every time they would fight after that, if they did.
But he did beat him, Frank, the first time, regardless of.
I know the record book doesn't say that, but he did. He doesn't say that, but he did win in the ring. So, in the main, there's no way I can pick Golovkin to beat Canelo. However, I think in this fight against Murata, I think he shook off some rust early. And after he shook the rust off early, it was probably even after 6 rounds. the difference in talent and offensive imagination came through Golovkin's jab. And, you could just say, you could see the difference in the two guys in the class. And I had said before the fight that Murata's aggression could help him if Golovkin is on the wrong side of the hill, but it could come back to hurt him because he was willing to answer the shots that Golovkin threw at him. I think for a second there, it looked like Golovkin punched himself out. He regained his form. And by the end of the fight, as I said earlier on Facebook, I think Murata looked like he was in a car accident. It was a very entertaining fight. It also looked to me that the Murata corner was really counting on Golovkin showing up old and being an empty package, because their game plans to me seem to try to burn him out early and hope he can't answer what they bring. And he could, he did. He won the fight convincingly. I thought his body looked very good. And as far as middleweights go, Jack, even though this is not vintage Golovkin, I think the only fighter campaigning at 160 right now who I might pick to beat him would be Jermall Charlo. So as washed up as some people think he is at 40 years old, he unified the title. He beat an outstanding fighter. And I really think that only Charlo is somebody that I would pick to beat him if they fight next or within the next year. I don't think he matches up with Canelo. Canelo's the bigger guy now. Golovkin doesn't like it to the body, and he's not good backing up. We saw in the last fight, Canelo made him back up. That's not Golovkin at his best.
Right. On a rounds basis, the three judges going into the ninth round had it 5-3, 6-2, and 7-1 for Golovkin. I gave Golovkin 6 of the 8 rounds. But, there's something to consider, that Murata's a national hero in Japan, and he is a good fighter. You can't take that away from him.
And he didn't lose anything in this fight. He would have kept going.
But think of what Golovkin did. He went into the other guy's home country where the crowd was 100% behind their national hero, and he got the job done. I mean, he kind of just grinded Murata down after a while. But I'm going to tell you this, he won't be able to grind Canelo down, because that's what Canelo always does to opponents. He comes on late in the fight most of the time. He outlasts opponents. So I don't see a scenario where Golovkin would outlast Canelo in a rematch.
Canelo's got the quicker hands. He is a great body puncher. He takes a great punch. He would really run Golovkin tired in the rematch, I believe. Jack, let me ask you something, because I was thinking about this. Golovkin is 40 years old. He's been in title fights for the last 10 years. We've really never seen him defeated decisively in the ring. Is there a case that maybe because he didn't have that big signature fight and he didn't get the decision against Canelo the first time, that he's a little underrated?
I'm going to tell you, a lot of fighters are underrated because they don't have a division where they spent their career. Golovkin's an exception to the rule. He's been a career middleweight.
And I respect him staying there.
Right, exactly. And you make a great point, Frank, because what exactly is Golovkin's legacy? There were, sanctioning bodies withstanding. What were they, like 20 title defenses, then additional title defenses on top of that? But like you're saying, Frank, what exactly is his legacy fight? That's what I always look for first. And I don't necessarily blame a fighter. Take a case of Vladimir Klitschko. He couldn't get a legacy fight till he was at the end of his career, like past his best. And where was Golovkin's big legacy?
His signature opponent, Jack, is Canelo, and the record says he's winless, and that hurts him. But there are many people out there. Now, this does nothing for his legacy, but there are a lot of people out there that believe that he is undefeated, that he beat Canelo both times. And I don't have a huge problem with that. I think Golovkin, again, clearly won the first fight, 8-4 at worst. And in the second fight, I think Canelo may have won by a point. But if you or someone else had Golovkin edging it out, I don't have a problem with it. But the thing is, here's a guy that has really never been beat.
I had Golovkin 7 rounds to 5. Both
Okay.
fights.
But here's the thing. Think about this. When you compare the two of them, their legacies and their persona, Canelo's here and Golovkin's down here. And really, if you think about it, Canelo in the ring, you could make a case lost 3 fights, and you could make a case Golovkin's undefeated. It just goes to show that the persona of some fighters. We hit it last week. We looked back at Hagler, Leonard. Everybody agrees what a great fighter Marvin Hagler is. Jack, we end up talking about Leonard, and now we're kind of talking about Golovkin when we're thinking about what a great, or talking about Canelo when we're looking at what a great career Golovkin has had.
Well, we could circle to Canelo. What is Canelo's legacy fight? I mean, to this point, you'd have to
Golovkin.
Legacy fights Golovkin. So where exactly does Canelo rate amongst the all-time greats? You know, what division would you put him in? I mean, even Roy Jones, what division would you put Roy Jones in where he would rate very highly as an all-time great in that division?
Well, for talent-wise, Jack, you could say Jones could live with any middleweight. If you go by what he did in the ring and career-wise, he's a light heavyweight.
Right, but he didn't stay long enough as a light heavyweight to be maybe considered one of the great light heavyweights of all time. He didn't stay long enough as a middleweight. I mean, in the past, we used to get these great fighters. They'd maybe move 2 divisions, like Sugar Ray Robinson, welterweight/middleweight. We could actually rate him separately in both divisions because he had a big body of work in both of them. You know, even a great
Jones's best body of work is light heavyweight, and when I think of him, where I'm going to rate him, I rate him among the light heavyweights. But if you want to look at middleweight, no, he didn't have a great run. The Hopkins fight was kind of his signature fight there. But that Jones could live with any middleweight that we have seen. As far as Canelo, I guess his legacy fight is Golovkin. Until at this time, he may have a couple more out there, but his legacy fight where he got over the hump, where people said he's really all that, was his record against Golovkin. And again, he didn't beat him convincingly the second time, and he lost convincingly the first time.
Before we move on from the Golovkin-Murata fight, what grade would you give Golovkin? I'd give him a B+, and the reason a B+, not an A. He was shaky early on, and he was hurt to the body, I thought, at one point, which really
absolutely
bode well against Canelo. But all in all, I think it was a very good performance by Golovkin, something he should be fully satisfied with.
Again, I would agree with that. I don't know about a letter grade because I don't know how I would break that down. But as far as his performance, shaky start, strong finish, look good. And at the end of the day, the guy's been a middleweight his whole career. I respect guys like Hagler, Monzon, and Golovkin that found their weight and were disciplined enough to stay there for the whole career and carve out a legacy. And again, in closing on Golovkin, Jack, the only fighter at 160 who I would possibly pick to beat him would be Jermall Charlo. And I'm not sure I would do that, but I would definitely be flirting with it.
There were other fights over the weekend. Ryan Garcia returned to the ring, and he beat Emmanuel Tagoe. I hope I'm pronouncing it right. Tagoe.
I think Lee said last week it's Tagoe.
Tagoe. Okay, thanks, Tagoe. And a lot of people are criticizing Ryan Garcia's performance. I thought he did well. He didn't win every round on the official scorecards. One judge gave Tagoe 1 round, the other gave him 2. But to me, Garcia pitched a shutout. Difficult opponent, kept moving, was in survival mode until the later rounds of the fight. Then he made a little effort to stand up to Garcia. And it seemed like Garcia kind of lost a little interest late in the fight. He had the decision locked up. All in all, it was a good comeback fight for Garcia. You know, he got in all the rounds going the distance. And then he called out Tank Davis after indirectly. He said, look, myself and Tank would be the best fight to make. And that would be a terrific fight to make. But Tank, of course, first has to take care of business May 28th at the Barclays Center against Raleigh Romero. And after he does that, I kind of doubt that fight would still be made because Tank is with Mayweather Promotions and Garcia's with Golden Boy, and Mayweather doesn't particularly care for De La Hoya and vice versa.
Didn't Tank and Mayweather separate?
No, they're still together. I mean, they're promoting the fight May 28th, okay, against Romero. So Tank was saying he was dissatisfied. I don't know what's on the contract, but I know they're but beyond this fight, but for this fight, they're contractually.
I didn't see the Garcia fight, Jack. So I'll see to what you say. However, a guy whose opinion I value very much told me he was a little bit disappointed in Joe Goosen the other night because he said he didn't really see much constructive instruction going on, and he thought Garcia could have been better than he was against a guy fighting to survive. You see anything there?
Yeah, no, I'm not going to be critical. I mean, Garcia's been off a while. He'd had some, mental health issues that, he's worked to clear up. And it was a question, when you've been off a while, you just want to come back. You want to look decent, get the win, not get caught.
No, he got the win.
And yeah, and then it's basically to move on from, from that. So,
now,
good win for Garcia, unbalanced, nothing to get excited about. It wasn't a spectacular one. On the
right, and no one expected that. Jack, the real fight, fight of the weekend was between Erickson Lubin and Sebastian Fundora.
Let me just backtrack just 1 second. On the undercard, just Garcia, because it's a Philly.
Oh, that's right.
A Philly guy, a guy who you, I'm sure, like a heck of a lot, Gabe Rosado. He, surprisingly got outpointed by Shane Mosley Jr. And Rosado had been on a good run. I know he's a bit long in the tooth, but, he'd been looking good for a while, unbalanced. Even when he lost fights like to Jaime Munguia, he looked fairly good, there.
There's a throwback, Jack, in Rosado, who he'll fight anybody, anywhere in their backyard. And I have to admit, we didn't get to that fight last week. But if you would have put me on the spot, I might have edged towards Rosado in that fight.
Well, same with me, because Rosado, the experienced, the established guy.
Right.
Shane Mosley Jr. hadn't shown me too much before. But he fought a smart fight. He had Clarence Bones Adams training him in the corner. Very smart, quick, did what he had to do. One judge had it even. That was a bit off, but I had it 97-93 for Mosley. Who was
that's not the only bad scoring we saw this week. But again, I missed that fight. I'm happy for Mosley Jr. I like Rosado, but again, long in the tooth. Guy had a great career. Ultimate respect for him. Was on a little bit of a run, so I thought maybe he had a little juice going in, but Mosley stepped up and by all accounts took care of business. Now, there was another fight that came on around 12:30 Saturday night on Showtime, and I'll tell you what, Jack, it has to be in the running for the fight of the year, and that was the bout between Erickson Lubin and Sebastian Fundora. A fight that we were kind of on opposite sides a little bit. I was leaning Fundora. I know you like Lubin. I will say this. I thought the size of Fundora and his work rate could be a problem. But if someone said to me that most of the fight was going to take place inside, I would have thought that Lubin would have fared better. The uppercuts that Fundora was landing inside so consistently and his work rate. And can you imagine being a junior middleweight and having a guy 6'6" nearly, and the guy is aggressive, and not only is he aggressive, he throws punches and he's not afraid to get off. I think sometimes he nullifies his reach. But I thought Fundora, except for a round or two, looked really good. I think it was a big win. And he's going to get the winner of the Charlo fight coming up next month. Do I think he'll beat Charlo? Right now, I would say no, but I do think he brings a lot to the table and can make it interesting.
He won't have to fight Charlo, Frank, because Brian Castano is going to beat Charlo again in the rematch. It was called a draw the first time, but this time Castano is going to get the decision. He's going to repeat what he did, and I trust that the judges are going to get it right.
We'll have some fun with that because I'm leaning Charlo.
But Castano will be more beatable for, the towering Inferno than with Charlo. So that gives him more of an opportunity. It's funny you mentioned, you wouldn't think a fight like that would be on the inside with the towering inferno. But there's certain myths in boxing, like tall guys should never fight on the inside. Why not? Just like they say, well, short guys shouldn't try to out-jab a taller guy. Why not? It's all
Jack,
about timing, Frank.
It is about timing, you're right.
Timing.
But we can name on one hand how many tall guys were excellent on the inside, and we could also name on one hand how many short guys won jabbing contests.
Not true, Frank.
In a big spot.
Not true.
And the guy 6'6", I want to get inside with him. And Fondora was just unbelievable inside, and his work rate was just off the chart, and he took some good punches. And let me say this about Erickson Lubin. He came back in the 9th round, and Jack, there's an interesting thing. Lubin scored the knockdown, and I believe it was scored 10-9 because Fondora dominated him for at least 2 minutes and 15 seconds, and then Lubin struck like lightning. He looked like Leonard going after Hearns in the 14th round of their first fight, dropped him, and you thought the fight may have turned there, but I think that was his last stand, and it was just too much for Lubin to overcome the size, the activity, and as Lee said, it was a 50-50 fight going in. I just like the physicality of Fondora in that fight. I think it's 6'6". He's a problem at junior middleweight. And you talked about the Mosley scoring, Jack. Let me just touch on this. I know you didn't see it live and you don't want to talk about it, but let me just tell you this. I can't believe all 3 judges had Lubin winning that fight. He was clearly losing that fight. He was being outworked. Fondora had a better connect percentage, and he was landing most of his big-time power shots. How the judges had Lubin ahead to this day, along with Steve Farhood, I will never know, and I'm glad that didn't go to a decision.
Okay. What's our anniversary fight or our spotlight fighter, Frank?
Jack, let's do our spotlight fighter, and that is one Marvin Pops Johnson, one of the most exciting fighters who has come along in the last 50 years. He was a bronze medal winner at 165 at the 72 games. He's a southpaw, retired 43-6, 35 knockouts, the first 3-time light heavyweight champ. He beat Matty Parlov, Victor Galindez, and Leslie Stewart in title bouts. Along the way, he defeated Gary Summerhays, Ray Anderson, Tom Bethea, Billy Douglas, Eddie Davis, Johnny Baldwin, Jerry Celestine, Victor Galindez, Johnny Davis, and Prince Charles Williams. The guy was an all-out, action-packed fighter, and he fought everybody on the baddest block in boxing, and he didn't step around any of the tough fights. And think about this, Jack. He loses to Saad Muhammad in 77 for the NABF title, but he gets a shot at the title against Parlov before Franklin gets a shot at the title at the time, and he wins the title. And instead of taking 3 easy fights, like Joe Lewis said after he lost to Schmeling, I don't feel like I'm the champ until I beat Schmeling. Marvin Johnson went at it with Matthew Saad Muhammad in April of 79, and one of the best fights we've ever seen. And all I can say about this, what a man he was. He lost that fight, but again, as it's been said earlier, he took his pound of flesh. And I will finish with this about Marvin Johnson. There are guys in Conestoga, Buddy McGirt being one of them, whose resume as a fighter doesn't equal Marvin Johnson's at all. Of his 6 losses, 2 are to Saad. One was to Eddie Mustafa, who should also be in the Hall of Fame. He lost to Spinks, and he lost to Lottie Maui, 5 world champions, and he deserves to be in there along with Saad and Spinks. And Keith Jackson had a saying about Marvin Johnson: when the bell rings, you start fighting. The guy was a crowd pleaser. He was just overshadowed by being one of the kids on the baddest block in boxing when you had Saad, Galindez, Eddie Muhammad, Michael Spinks, Rossman. The division was stacked then, and he was right in the middle of the pack, one of the outstanding borderline great fighters of the last 50 years.
Right, yeah, I'm not going to put up a big argument if you say Marvin Johnson is a Hall of Famer. Certainly, if you want to compare his career to Buddy McGirt, he might stack up well. You know, it's a different type career. I mean, I have a vote for the Hall of Fame, okay? I haven't voted for Marvin Johnson to date, but he has been on my radar, okay? He has been on my radar. And going forward, maybe I will vote for him. The thing with Marvin Johnson, and he was pretty unfortunate about this. He was never the top dog on the block in the light heavyweight division. That, you know, maybe had he come along another time, you know, he couldn't get over the top against Matthew Saad Muhammad. No disgrace, you know, great fight, you know, he really did battle with Saad Muhammad, fought him on virtually equal terms, and Saad eventually prevailed, and that's in part why he got the nickname Miracle Matt. He couldn't beat, you know, Michael Spinks, Eddie Mustafa Muhammad. You know, he's got off to a good start with Spinks. Even, I think, won the first 3 rounds, then got nailed with a big uppercut / hook and basically got put out. And
Jack, at that time, they thought he was done. He came back and won 16 fights and won the title again.
Right, but what works in his favor, why I might have to reassess how I vote as well, he did have 2 victories that you could maybe call defining wins in his career. Beating Matty Parlow overseas, that's a big win. That's a big win. And he did stop Victor Galindez, even though Galindez was probably, you know, he was towards the end of his career. He fought only one more time after Galindez in the fight that he lost. But at the time Johnson knocked him out, we didn't know that Galindez was towards the end. So perhaps we have to judge a guy when the fight took place, what he accomplished. Just because an opponent falls apart after, soon shows he doesn't have much left. Do we really hold it against him? And there was some other good wins. He beat Eddie Davis a couple of fights after Eddie Davis nearly beat Michael Spinks.
He gave Spinks his toughest fight at 175.
Right. So, and, you know, and he was a bronze medalist. But the point about it, he's a terrific fighter, Marvin Johnson. But do we but for the people who say, oh, it's ludicrous, he's not in the Hall of Fame, I say it's ludicrous for them to say it's ludicrous, because there's something about the Hall of Fame. What are your standards? Doesn't it have to be the very best guys, not guys who just are the best of the rest? I mean, they're the Hall of Famers, and then they're the best of the rest. You make
all right, Jack, let me ask you this.
Yeah, no, about the Buddy McGirt argument, and you mentioned some other fighters, that would be Marvin Johnson's best argument, doing that cross comparison, perhaps.
No, and Lee, I agree with you. The second fight was not as good as the first fight, but let me just go back at Jack for a second. Jack, Ken Norton is in the Hall of Fame. Ingemar Johansson are in the Hall of Fame. You're going to tell me that they have better careers than Marvin Johnson when Norton's claim to fame is beating Muhammad Ali one time? Maybe he gave him trouble, and maybe he might have got the decision in one of the second 2 fights, but he didn't. He beat Jerry Quarry, who took the fight on 8 days' notice. His win over Jimmy Young is disputed. So I think Marvin Johnson's wins
didn't take the fight on 8 days' notice.
Yes, he did.
It was a main event in Madison Square Garden.
You're right, Jack, but Quarry was a replacement for Oscar Bonavena.
True.
No, Quarry took that fight on 8 days' notice.
No, Quarry had time. Quarry wasn't in the best shape.
Jack, he took the fight on 8 days' notice.
No.
He had short notice on that fight. Jerry Quarry was a shell of himself after the second Frazier fight, but he couldn't turn down the money. Him and Norton had bad blood, and Quarry said, I don't need to be in great shape to beat him.
Dundee picked Jerry Quarry to beat Ken Norton in that fight.
He picked Jimmy Ellis to beat Joe Frazier, too.
No. That was a guy he was training. Of course, he's going to say a guy he's training is going to beat.
And he picked Quarry to beat Frazier. Jack, I'm telling you, Quarry did not have a full camp, and at that time, it might not have mattered. But Marvin Johnson's record and who he fought and the way he fought, he was much more consistent than Buddy McGirt and Ingemar Johansson. Tell me about him.
Well,
Eddie Mason and Floyd Patterson.
Let me tell you the difference involved. You make a good point. if Ingemar Johansson was hypothetically a middleweight or light heavyweight, no, he wouldn't belong in the Hall of Fame. But he was a heavyweight. It's called Hall of Fame. And heavyweights, like it or not, okay, can usually beat anyone else because they're heavyweights, okay? A good heavyweight, an Ingemar Johansson, for example, would be favored to beat a Marvin Hagler, for example, because he's bigger. He's a heavyweight, and the other guy's a middleweight.
I have no idea where you're going here, but go ahead.
It's a little different with heavyweights, okay? Heavyweights are given a certain pass as far as the Hall of Fame goes because they are the best fighters in the world by virtue of their size.
I'd put Jerry Quarry in the Hall of Fame before. If that's the case, Jack, Jerry Quarry belongs in the Hall of Fame before Johansson because he has actually better wins on his record, and he fought him at least even up when they fought. I don't want to hear about it's a heavyweight. Marvin Johnson's career stands on its own merits alone, and he definitely should be in the Hall of Fame. If we have McGirt and Johansson in there, look, Norton's going to be a little hard to argue against because he beat Ali, and some people think he beat him three times.
I'm not arguing against Marvin Johnson's potential inclusion into the Hall of Fame.
Jack, if he was around today, how do you think he would do? Who would beat him today? What light heavyweight would beat him today?
Beterbiev would beat him.
Beterbiev would beat him.
Yeah.
All right.
Beterbiev's best. Yeah. But
well, I'm not sure I agree with that. I don't think it's ludicrous, but I'm not sure I agree with that. But other than Beterbiev, he would beat everybody else in the light heavyweight division. And Jack, think of it this way. Is Esteban de Jesus a Hall of Famer in your mind?
No, it comes a little short.
Okay, how about Rodrigo Valdez?
Rodrigo Valdez, yeah.
Okay, and what do they have in common? Esteban was around the same time as Duran, one of, if not the greatest lightweight ever, in the top three. And Rodrigo Valdez, how many great middleweights? I don't care if you go from Harry Greb to Golovkin. How many great middleweights would beat Benny Briscoe 3 out of 3 times? I don't think many.
I just said Rodrigo Valdez. I support. He's not in the Hall, but has my vote for getting.
But my point is this: sometimes your birth certificate it's a curse.
Absolutely.
When you're born at that time. It's look at Jerry Quarry. He could have probably been champ, but Ali and Frazier owned the division then. Monzon was there for Valdez. So I don't hold that against Marvin Johnson. To me, who did you beat and who beat you? And nobody, no Jose Luis Garcia beat Marvin Johnson. Nobody like that. I definitely think he belongs in there based on how he would do head-to-head and his accomplishments in the ring. Is he an all-time great? No. But losing to Saad Spinks and Eddie Mustafa Muhammad.
Yeah, I mean, you make a good point. Listen, I'm not, like I said, I'm not going to argue passionately against Marvin Johnson. I'm very willing to reassess Marvin Johnson's situation. And if I reassess it, basically, he beat Matty Palaf, he beat Victor Galendez, he beat Eddie Davis. Those are darn good wins. He beat Leslie Stewart. He lost the rematch to Stewart, but he was long in the tooth. Marvin Johnson was at the end of his career when that happened. So I can't hold that against Marvin Johnson.
I mean, Jack, think about this. Everybody talks about some of the great fighters because of who they beat. Muhammad Ali, in most debates, would probably be considered the #1 heavyweight of all time. And the first thing they would say is, look who he beat. Okay, that's fine. Are we going to penalize the guys that he beat because they lost to him? I kind of think it applies to Johnson, too.
Is Ernie Terrell a Hall of Famer?
No, he comes a little short.
But wait. But eliminate the Ali match. Look at all the good wins he had.
Okay, Eddie Machen, Doug Jones,
George Chuvalo, Cleveland Williams, Bob.
He lost to Williams, too.
Okay, Bob Forster. I mean, I'm just saying.
I think he's on the cusp. I don't think it's crazy. Okay. I think he's on the cusp.
That's how I feel about Marvin Johnson.
Okay.
He's on the cusp, and you make a good compelling argument, Frank. You may have gotten Marvin Johnson an extra vote this year.
And Jack, think about it. And even though he was 0-2 against Saad, I have no doubt in my mind those two fights took a lot out of Saad. And I think I heard Russell Peltzer, I read in his book, he said the best fight he ever saw live was the first Marvin Johnson, Matthew Franklin fight. I was at that fight, and I'll tell you what, Marvin Johnson hit Saad, or Franklin at the time. Jack, he hit him with some uppercuts. I don't know how Saad's head didn't end up in the rafters. And I remember at the time, it's funny, quick story, Johnson trained at Frazier's gym about 10 days before the fight. And George Bent was working with him. And he said on the last day when he's done training, he says, Johnson, let me tell you something. He goes, this Franklin is a strong SOB. You don't want to trade with this guy. You got to box him. If you box him and you don't go after him and you don't get him mad and you leave him alone, you have a good chance to beat him. But if you bother him and you get him going and you try to trade with him, you're going to have problems. And what happened was Saad would not let Marvin box. And Marvin was the type guy, he liked to fight and trade. And he just happened to come up against a guy that had a little bit bigger guns.
Yeah, and also another point that's really well taken, Frank, is sometimes when a fighter loses a fight, it actually elevates him to an extent because it depends on the way, he lost the fight too. I'm just taking a quick glance here. Good wins beating Prince Charles Williams. I think you mentioned that with Marvin Johnson.
Later in his career.
Taking a look down, at the
Juan Maria, maybe he was a good fighter, and then I heard he couldn't get in great shape for the second fight with Leslie Stewart, but no excuse. He lost and he never fought again.
Well, the two fights with Matthew Saad Muhammad were absolute barn burners, in a way. So it's whose career should have maybe compared Marvin Johnson, so maybe a little bit Arturo Gatti's. Gatti would get the occasional very nice victory, but would come up a bit short against the elite guys.
Yeah, but Johnson did beat a couple elite guys, so I ranked him a little bit ahead.
So you put him ahead, and Gatti was a little more exciting, even though Johnson was very exciting in his own right.
Yeah, you don't want to miss either one of their fights. No.
Good job, Frank. It's selling me on Johnson a little more so.
Jack, he was a killer. I love the guy. Think about this. He fights the toughest guy out there who beat him in his first title defense. Nobody would do that today. Is it a great business decision? No, but that's why we love some of the old school guys, because of that mindset.
Got a bronze medal in the 72 Olympics.
Right, as a middleweight.
And it was a little more prestigious maybe to get the medals at that time, than it is today.
He beat the Cuban and lost to the Russian.
Yeah.
And that was the first year the Cubans were at the games, was in 72.
And another thing to consider if I'm making a case for Marvin Johnson, he's from Indianapolis. How many great fighters came out of Indianapolis? So consider the territory involved too.
Right. Although I would shade myself from that because I just want to go on the merit, but I get your point. All right, Jack, let's get to another barn burner. And two guys had a night. On April 15th, 1985, Marvin Hagler fought the signature fight of his career and the fight that pushed him over the top, where people realized he was one of the greats, when he defended the title against Tommy the Hitman Hearns. Going into that fight, Hagler was 2-2 with 50 knockouts. His only losses were to Boogaloo Watts and Willie the Worm Monroe, and he avenged both of those. Hearns was 40-1. 34 knockouts. The one was the Sugar Ray Leonard. After Leonard beat Hearns, Hearns went on to win the junior middleweight title. And when Leonard was taken out of the picture in 82, Hagler was searching for big-name opponents. He got Roberto Duran in 83. Wasn't a stellar performance for Marvin that night. And then Hearns comes along, Jack, and he ices Duran with one punch. a year later, and that pretty much set the table for the Hagler-Hearns fight. And I am in agreement with most people that the first round of Hagler-Hearns may be the greatest round in boxing history. I'm not sure the fight was. The second two rounds were a lot calmer, but the first round of that fight is one of the all-time greats. And in closing, on my part, I would just say this about Marvin Hagler. He made one of the best strategic adjustments in that fight than he ever made. Jack, when people think of Marvin Hagler, they think of a guy who's like a Mike Tyson, a knockout, seek and destroy type guy. Hagler was a boxer puncher. He was a technician. And he made the best gamble in his life when he realized when he fought Hearns, nobody outboxes Hearns. Leonard couldn't outbox him. I'm not going to outbox him. I have to get inside and make it a street fight. And that's what he did. And he knew doing that he was going to have to eat some of those right hands. And he was rocked a few times, but he realized it's worth the price because mine are going to affect him more. What a great fight. Love both of those guys. And let's not forget, Hearns did fracture his right hand in the first round. It had to affect him. I don't know if he would have defeated Hagler that night. I would have liked to have seen a rematch. But as we know, Leonard put an end to that.
Styles make fights. They could have fought 10. If they fought 10 times at their very best, Hagler wins every single time. It's just the question. Hearns could keep away from Hagler for only so long. If that's what he tried to do, eventually Hagler catches up to Hearns. Hearns wouldn't exhibit the same durability, let's say, that a Sugar Ray Leonard would, exhibit. It's just a question of styles in that fight. But much to Hagler's maybe surprise, if he was thinking along those lines, he came right after Hearns at the opening bell. Like you're saying, Frank, he couldn't hope to really outbox him. He had to take it to him, and Hearns stood up and he accommodated him. And it was a great slugfest. But Ben Dowdy, a mutual friend of ours, has posted only the first round was truly a great round. Round second and 3-1 is good. And when you watch the replay, Ben has a point that's well taken. But I remember when I saw it live, people were yelling themselves hoarse until the very end. So if rounds 2 and 3 weren't nearly as good, round 1 carried everyone over.
Round 1 set. Well, round 2 and 3, Jack, were great, but round 1 was just so off the chart. There's no way any human beings could have kept that pace. And I'm reading here what Lee said. Lee, I agree with you to a point. I do think Hearns was more versatile and could have changed strategies. I'm just not sure Hagler would have let him. Because Hagler knew with knowing a rematch, he could take his punch and he could push the fight. And it's somewhere along the line, I think they would have to go toe-to-toe, 1 for 1. And even though Hearns was the much greater puncher of the two, Hagler's chin evened that out. And, it's amazing. When Hearns knocked out Duran, that fight became a monster because here you have Duran, a lightweight a few years earlier, 5 years earlier, giving Hagler all kind of trouble, sticking his tongue out at him. And at the end of the fight, Duran is not even marked up or beaten up, bruised, or cut. And Hagler had to rally down the stretch to seal it. And then Hearns comes along and he brutalizes Duran. And then everybody thought, what happens to Hagler?
In reality, Hagler won 10 of the 15 rounds against Duran. The judges had it closer than they should have. Listen, it didn't matter what type of fight Hearns is going to fight. Hearns at his very best would never beat Hagler at Hagler's very best. I said before they could fight 10 times at their best. Hagler beats him every single time. Duran against Hagler, they can fight 10 times. Hagler never stops Duran in any of the 10 fights. It's just the way it is. Certain styles,
Jack, exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, and you want to know part of it too. You got the feeling when Hearns fought Hagler Hagler was the physically stronger guy. I agree with you that Hearns was the more explosive puncher, more explosive. I agree there, but he was the physically stronger guy. And when they started going head to head, it was Hearns who was forced back the whole fight. He wasn't able to impose his physical strength on Hagler and push Hagler back. He had to nail Hagler with a big punch. And Hearns was,
and Hagler took it, and that was the difference in the fight. He could take it and push him back. That was a big difference in that. Hagler's chin was the difference in that fight. But if you look at them against other guys, Hearns actually matches up better with some of them than Hagler does. I mean, think about it. Hearns hurt and rocked Sugar Ray Leonard more than Hagler ever did. Again,
like if Hearns fought Leonard 10 times, I can make an argument Leonard wins 7, Hearns 3. You could argue with me 6-4. You might say
8-2. I agree.
8-2. You know, he doesn't go 10-0 Leonard. He doesn't go. I mean, Hearns wins a couple of them in there. Okay, I just don't. And if Hagler fights Leonard 10 times, you know, it would have been.
They could split.
Yeah,
although I believe Leonard.
For Leonard, maybe, or something along those lines. That would be my feeling. Duran, Hagler, you know, if Duran at his best, he wins some of the time. Maybe they split him and Hagler, you know, 5-5 at their very best.
But Duran never beats Hearns.
Right, at their very best.
Never. He loses 10 out of 10.
I think he get one win in there, you know, Star Wars. Duran.
I'm going to tell you why he wouldn't, Jack. Because Hearns and Duran is basically Frazier and Foreman at junior middleweight. Frazier, to be effective, has to get inside. He met one man who could hurt him before he got inside, and that was Foreman. That happened. That would happen every time they fight, and I think the same thing with Duran. Duran cannot beat Hearns outside. He's got to get inside, and Hearns sets him up with the jab and right hand. I think he beats him every time.
I'm going to destroy your argument, Frank, completely destroy it, and I'm going to have you bowing down on this. The Joe
Not a
Frazier,
chance.
Listen to me. The Joe Frazier of March 8th, 1971. If that Joe Frazier showed up 10 different times against Foreman, are you going to tell me he doesn't win once?
I'm going to tell you he goes 0-10 and he stopped.
No
and
kidding.
You know for a fact Joe Frazier admitted that to you, and I know how highly he thought of George. He thought of George Foreman. Jack,
you don't think he get one win? You don't think he get one?
Jack, think about this. Foreman can do what no one else can do because he has the reach, a great uppercut, and he has power. Joe can't get inside. And if Foreman hurts him before he gets inside, what is Frazier to do? We saw in the rematch. Yeah, Frazier was long in the tooth then, but he tried to back up and he just couldn't do nothing, and it prolonged the inevitable. And if Duran fought Hearns a second time, what would he do? He wouldn't go after him. He would try to back up and fight him like he did Hagler. That's not going to work against Hearns. It's just a bad matchup.
You made a comment about Hagler Hearns that I want to expand on a little bit. You said the first round, correct me if I'm wrong here, is the greatest round in boxing history. I think you should change the terminology. Call it the most action-packed round in boxing history, not the greatest. The 15th round of Norton Holmes was a greater round because it was the 15th round. Those guys weren't fresh, and they emptied their tank, okay? The 15th round of Norton and Holmes, or the first round of Dempsey-Firpo. Dempsey gets knocked to his knees. He knocks Firpo down 7 times. Firpo knocks him out of the ring. I mean, that was a little greater and most action-packed round, like give and take. That's how I think we should describe it, you know, Hagler Hearns.
I think Hagler and Hearns, I agree, more exciting, but I think Holmes and Norton, I think the skill level was a little bit better and they weren't as wild. where Hagler and Hearns.
No, Hagler and Hearns went wild. I mean, they were just
Jack. They were really swinging from the fence. Where I think Norton and Holmes were a little bit more composed. But both of those are great rounds. Hagler Hearns was a little more one-sided.
The ninth round, the Gaddy Wood.
That's another great round.
Yeah,
that's another great round. Yeah, there's been some tremendous rounds, and Hagler Hearns, though, I think the consensus is because of the activity, the magnitude of the fight, who the fighters were. I think most people would say that's the greatest round. Now, you could make a case that Holmes Norton as heavyweights might be one of the greater rounds in history.
You know, we could put a title next to so many rounds. Like we could call one action-packed, one greater. I could give you a title of the first round of the first Quarry Frazier fight. Now,
I was just going to say that.
Yeah, but how about if we labeled it, Frank, the most rugged round in boxing history? Rugged. We used that word. Frazier Quarry. They, head to head.
That's up there.
Yeah, and but it wasn't the most exciting round, but maybe the toughest round.
They went head to head, and Quarry got the better of that round. The problem was with Quarry when he fought Frazier was Joe Frazier could go 100 mile an hour for 10 rounds. Quarry could go 100 mile an hour for about 3. Eventually, he has to come up for air, and that's where Joe pushes him down. But that was round of the year in 1969. That was fight of the year in 69. And that was sure one hell of a round.
And I could tell you a round that was maybe better than that with Joe Frazier, first round. And no one seems to remember. Manuel Ramos, a Mexican. First round, he hit Frazier, shot, and Frazier admits he was dazed. He was bobbing and weaving. That round has been forgotten in history. It was a 2-round fight. Ramos was pulled out at the end of the second round. But that was like nonstop. But certain fights are kind of forgotten in history.
I think that was more one-sided, except for that one punch.
Yeah, exactly. But
I agree with
one punch for punch. But it was really entertaining.
I agree with Lee. Bo Holyfield, round 10 of their first fight is up there. And you know what's amazing? We're talking about tonight about guys that have heart, like Johnson, Hearns, Hagler, and whatnot. If you remember that round, it looked like Bo had Holyfield beat to death. And Holyfield became Hulk. And at the end of the round, he was beating up Bo. What Holyfield, Jack, if we're going to talk about tough guys with heart and courage, heavyweights, Holyfield's in that conversation.
Without question. You know what I never thought about before, Frank? And not talking now, it's kind of thought-provoking. The old-timers, how many of them have been in slugfests that we remember for one particular round where they went at it, like legacy rounds? We're talking about fighters now who have legacy rounds. You talk about fighters with legacy fights, but how many fighters have legacy rounds? We just started mentioning some, and they're not from like the fighters 100 years ago. Before, I mean, how many of them had the great Henry Armstrong? Did he ever have one round we went like, wow? Sugar Ray Robinson had his legacy rounds against Randy Turpin when he was cut, the one punch with Gene Fulmer, those dramatics. But how many have legacy rounds? Okay, Joe Louis, the second Schmeling fight, the Billy Conn knockout. But even the great Harry Greb, did he ever have a legacy round? That I can't think of one off the top of my head.
Top of my head, because, and remember, we can't see his fight, so it would be very hard to decipher.
We've heard about him, and nothing, the great Willie Pep, did he ever have a legacy round per se? You kind of like wonder. It's, interesting point, with certain fights.
I'll give you a legacy round. Salvador Sanchez versus Gomez, round 8.
I wouldn't call that a legacy round. I'm going to tell you why. By the time the 8th round started, it was pretty apparent Sanchez was going to win the fight. This wasn't the same Gomez. He'd had substance abuse problems. And what I thought you were going to mention, and I thought this would have been unfair to Azuma Nelson, the Sanchez-Nelson 15th round, a legacy round. because Nelson came in on about a week's notice. So that was and considering it came in a week's notice, no one knew how good Azuma Nelson was going to be. He was just another
because
guy.
he didn't lose until he fought Pernell Whitaker after Sanchez.
Right. Because Azuma Nelson was basically unknown for the most part. That shouldn't affect his legacy.
Jack, you do remember, though, Gomez was favored over Sanchez going in. Gomez was the favorite in that fight. And Sanchez put him down in the first round. So maybe that was the round that dictated the fight. But I'm not quite sure what your definition of legacy round is. I mean, a round that we won't forget because of what happened.
We remember. Yeah, we remember. Like Hagler Hearns, the first round of the fight, you could remember. I mean, listen, Frazier Ali, maybe the legacy round people like to remember is the 15th round of the first fight.
Wasn't the best round of the three fights, but that's the one everybody remembers.
Exactly. Foreman Ali, they'll remember the legacy round when Foreman went down. In the 8th round. And listen, Frazier Foreman, the first round with Howard Cosell made that round. Down goes Frazier, the way he was.
One of the all-time iconic calls.
Right, exactly. So it's an interesting thing about legacy rounds with like certain fighters. I mean, listen, Jake LaMotta, what was his legacy round? I guess it's the movie Raging Bull when he wouldn't go down. It really should be when he knocked out Laurent
Dotiel because he was 40 seconds away or 20 seconds away from losing the title.
But no one basically talks about that. They'll talk about the pounding he took against Sugar Ray Robinson as a legacy round. I mean, it kind of like all depends. I think, Frank, part of
Jack, we're sitting here talking. We forgot completely about Spence and Ugas.
How
can we forget that?
Let's get that preview in, Frank.
All right. My thoughts are, I jotted some things down, Jack. Both are terrific body punchers. Spence likes to come in behind his jab, carrying the Ugas Spence likes to come in behind his jab. Ugas is fundamentally sound, uses some left-hand feints, whacks to the body really good, a little unpredictable, physically strong, unorthodox. But here's the thing. He's not real busy. I think the fact that Spence, even though in the big fights, is actually more boxer than puncher, I think in this fight, if Ugas doesn't give him something to think about, I think he's going to turn the heat up and go at him a little bit harder. We don't have much time to cover it. I'll just say this. Ugas is a real opponent. He's tough to fight. I think Spence is going to have a chip on his shoulder. He has a lot to prove. He has been mentioning the name Terrence Crawford a lot more. He realizes that's his legacy fight. He has to get by Ugas to win the fight. I can't pick against Spence, Jack. I think he wins the fight. I'm not sure he stops him, but I will say this. The same thing that happened with Golovkin and Murata, both guys like to fight as the alpha. Because of that mindset, we have a chance to see a very, very exciting fight while it lasts.
I think Errol Spence is going to win. I don't think he wants any part of Terrence Crawford. It's just talk. He's avoided Crawford at all costs to this point. I think he's going to continue to do so. I think Errol Spence doesn't have the heart of a real champion. He'll fight hard in the ring. He wants no part of Terrence Crawford. He's going to demand the lion's share, the money. That's going to be his excuse to back out.
Okay, you like to talk about that, Jack. Let me ask you this. Because I do think...
We're nearly done, Frank. I mean, as far as we don't have much time, but I think Ugas is very technically good wins.
He's a fundamental. He's excellent.
Now James nearly beat Sean Porter. Some people think he did. I like Spence by decision. What were you going to ask, Frank? And we have to go. We're going to be off the air soon.
We have about 55 seconds. All right, let me say this. I believe if Spence wins, the ball will start to roll for he and Crawford. Now, what do you think? And you've asked me this before off the air when we talk. What do you think the purse split should be in that fight?
I would do this if I'm Crawford. 50-50 if I win, and I'd say, Spence, if you win, it's 60-40 in your favor if you win. So if Spence is confident he could beat him and get it 60-40 cut, And if Spence loses, it's 50-50. Remember, Crawford's rated ahead of Spence on all pound-for-pound lists.
But Spence will have 3 titles. It'll be interesting. I would like to see a 55-45 split. I can understand Spence getting the lion's share. So we'll see if it happens.
I understand that.
Jack, great show.
Good going, Frank. And yeah, good work on the Marvin Johnson thing.